Far away in the northern reaches of South Africa, the land undulates in soft hills. The red earth is broken by pockets of grassland, thorny trees, and rocky ridges that rise quietly against the sky. This region is now known as the Cradle of Humankind. It is a place rich in limestone, riddled with caverns and tunnels that stretch deep beneath the surface. Rainwater and time have shaped the rock into a hidden labyrinth, a dark underworld lying beneath the sunlit savanna. For millions of years, creatures have slipped into these voids. Some entered by chance. Some may have been carried in by predators. Others were drawn there with intention, leaving traces of choices and patterns that still puzzle researchers today. At that moment when the landscape is still, one can imagine the weight of time pressing down. Beneath the roots of acacias, beneath the layers of sediment, chambers lie sealed. For centuries, their entrances collapse, their passages narrow. Bones rest there in silence, undisturbed. They wait until the curiosity of modern explorers and the narrow beams of artificial light disturb their sleep. The Cradle of Humankind holds more than just stone and silence. It preserves a history stretching across more than 3 million years of hominin evolution. Fossils of Australopithecus, Paranthropus, and early Homo species have been uncovered here, each one a piece of a complex family tree. Yet, among these finds, one discovery stands apart. Deep within a branching cave system called Rising Star, researchers uncovered bones unlike any they had seen before. They did not belong to known modern humans, nor did they match the robust jaws of Australopithecines or the heavy brow ridges of earlier Homo erectus. Instead, they revealed something unexpected. Step by step, the explorers who entered Rising Star in 2013 moved through passages barely wider than their bodies. The route twisted, fell sharply downward, then constricted again. Some corridors measured only 20 centimeters across. Reaching the chamber required flexibility, endurance, and courage. It was a place few could access, and certainly not a site where water or large animals could have easily deposited remains. What they discovered inside would alter discussions about human origins in profound ways. Bones covered the floor of a hidden chamber. They were fragile, darkened by mineral deposits, yet remarkably preserved. Hundreds of fragments were scattered, representing multiple individuals. Some skeletons were nearly complete, with skulls, spines, ribs, and delicate hand bones resting near one another. As the bones were lifted, catalogued, and studied, a clearer picture emerged. They belonged to a previously unknown species. In 2015, it was named Homo Naledi. The word Naledi means star in the Sotho language, chosen for the Rising Star cave where the remains were found. The fossils told a story of a being that blended traits of the ancient and the modern. Their skulls were small, housing brains no larger than those of chimpanzees, yet their hands, with curved fingers, showed both the capacity for climbing and the precision of tool use. Their feet were strikingly similar to ours, built for long-distance walking. Their teeth were small and simple, unlike the heavy chewing teeth of older Australopithecines. This mixture of features suggested a species that had survived in Africa long after others with similar anatomy had vanished. The age of the fossils surprised researchers even further. Dating methods indicated that Homo naledi lived between 236,000 and 335,000 years ago. This was not deep prehistory. This was the same time period in which early Homo sapiens were beginning to spread across the African continent. It was also a time when Neanderthals were present in Europe and Denisovans in Asia. Homo Naledi therefore shared the stage with multiple human lineages, existing at a moment of branching complexity. But the question remained: how did so many individuals come to rest in such a remote chamber? The chamber had no natural opening from above. There was no evidence of catastrophic flooding. There were no marks of predation. The bones did not arrive through chance alone. They had been placed there. That realization gave rise to one of the deepest mysteries in paleoanthropology. If Homo Naledi deliberately deposited their dead in the depths of rising star, they displayed a behavior once thought restricted to species with much larger brains. The possibility of intentional burial challenged long-standing assumptions about intelligence, symbolism, and care for the dead. Scientists debated whether such actions required abstract thought or ritual. Could a species with a brain scarcely half the size of Homo sapiens have conceived of death in such a way? The chamber itself seemed to whisper that they had. Outside these caves, the African landscape was undergoing shifts. Climate cycles driven by glacial pulses far to the north caused rainfall patterns to change. Wet periods allowed rivers and grasslands to expand, supporting herds of antelope, zebra, and elephant. Dry periods drew back the vegetation, leaving open plains dotted with scattered waterholes. These fluctuations forced all hominins to adapt, moving with the seasons, learning where food and shelter could be found. In this world, life was precarious, yet Homo Naledi found a way to persist. A lesser-known detail adds weight to the discovery. In addition to adult remains, the rising star chamber contained bones of children and even infants. Their tiny teeth and delicate skull fragments lay alongside those of adults. The presence of young individuals suggested that the chamber was not a place of random disposal. It hinted at repeated acts, carried out over time, possibly reflecting a social pattern. Still, much is unknown. Some scholars argue that the remains might have accumulated through falls, even if the chamber seems too remote for that. Others suggest that Homo Naledi may have sought shelter deep in the caves and never returned. Yet the clustering of skeletons, the absence of injuries consistent with falls, and the sheer number of individuals all strengthen the idea of purposeful placement. The planetary scale frames this mystery in a wider light. Around 300,000 years ago, glaciers in the northern hemisphere grew, locking water into ice. Global sea levels fell. Winds shifted, reshaping deserts and grasslands across Africa. Within these vast cycles, small groups of hominins, Neanderthals, Denisovans, early Homo sapiens, and now Homo Naledi, adapted in parallel. Each developed strategies to face uncertainty. Each left behind traces in soil, stone, and bone. Rising Star's silent chamber became one such trace carved into deep time. In the darkness beneath the hills, Homo Naledi left behind more than skeletons. They left questions that reach to the heart of what it means to be human. Did they understand death? Did they seek to protect the living from the sight and smell of decay? Did they place their kin in the earth with care, acknowledging bonds that extended beyond life? These are mysteries still debated, but the very presence of their bones, hidden away with such improbability, keeps the questions alive. And so, the story of Homo Naledi begins not with a march across open plain, nor with the making of tools, but with the stillness of a cave. It begins in a darkness that once held flickers of torchlight, narrow passages pressed by climbing body, and the quiet laying down of the dead. It begins with echoes in stone, preserved until we are ready to listen. In the year 2013, a team of cavers and scientists turned their attention to the Rising Star cave system, not far from Johannesburg. This region, part of the Cradle of Humankind, had already revealed treasures of deep time. Yet what was hidden in Rising Star surpassed expectation. The cave mouth itself gave little hint of what lay beyond. It was a narrow opening in the limestone, one of many in the region. To enter was to leave behind the brightness of the South African sun and step into a darkness that demanded patience and skill. The cave system branched and twisted, passages dipping downward, then tightening to mere slits in the rock. Some spaces could only be crossed on hands and knees. Others forced explorers to flatten their bodies and slide forward, stone pressing from all sides. The deeper they went, the more difficult the air became, heavy and stale. For those who dared, the journey was not simply physical, but psychological. The cave demanded calm persistence. It demanded trust in one's body and in one's companions. Among the team that entered Rising Star were members of a specially selected group called the Underground Astronauts. These were women trained in both caving and archaeology, chosen for their small frames and ability to maneuver through tight spaces. Their task was to reach the chamber at the system's heart, a place nearly impossible for most adults to enter. With helmets, headlamps, and ropes, they lowered themselves into shafts, inched sideways through crevices, and descended into the unknown. Step by step, they moved where no sunlight had touched for thousands upon thousands of years. When their lights finally illuminated the chamber floor, they saw something unexpected. Bones lay scattered across the sediment, not of animals recently fallen, but of creatures long extinct. At first glance, the remains suggested a hominin form. The explorers saw skulls, ribs, and femurs. The air was thick, the chamber cramped. But the significance of the sight was unmistakable. They had found a hidden deposit, a burial of sorts, in a place too difficult to imagine as a simple accident. The collection of bones was large. As excavations continued, scientists realized they were not dealing with a single individual, nor even two or three. Instead, more than a dozen distinct individuals were represented. Some skeletons were nearly complete, lying in positions that suggested little disturbance after placement. Teeth, finger bones, and delicate vertebrae had survived. The chamber preserved them with extraordinary clarity. For paleoanthropology, it was one of the richest finds in recent decades. The discovery raised immediate questions. Who were these beings? They did not look like modern humans. The skulls were too small, their cranial capacity much less than ours. The brow ridges were pronounced, the jaws narrower. Yet their feet looked almost entirely human, with arches built for walking upright. Their hands blended ancient and modern traits, curved fingers hinting at climbing ability, but wrists and thumbs capable of gripping tools. This mosaic of features did not fit neatly into existing categories. The fossils were carefully lifted bone by fragile bone. Each fragment was catalogued and placed into protective bags. Back above ground, researchers began the slow process of reconstruction. They compared the remains to known species, Australopithecus, Homo erectus, early Homo sapiens. The match was not exact with any of them. Piece by piece, the evidence pointed toward a new species, one never before recognized. It was not simply another variant of early human. It was distinct, with a combination of traits unique to itself. The name chosen was Homo Naledi. The genus placed it within the human lineage, while the word Naledi, meaning star in Sotho, honored the cave where it was found. Announced in 2015, the discovery drew global attention. Newspapers, journals, and lectures all carried the news. Another branch of the human family had been uncovered, hidden in darkness for hundreds of thousands of years. A lesser-known detail is the role played by local collaboration. The Rising Star project was notable not only for its scientific achievement, but also for its openness. The fieldwork involved cavers, archaeologists, and volunteers. Digital scans of fossils were shared widely, allowing scientists around the world to study the remains almost in real time. This openness helped speed analysis and ensured that debates about the bones were broad, involving many voices. Still, mysteries surrounded the find. Dating the bones proved difficult. Limestone caves are tricky environments, where sediments are disturbed over long spans. Eventually, using uranium series dating and electron spin resonance, researchers estimated an age between 236,000 and 335,000 years. That meant Homo Naledi lived relatively recently, sharing Africa with early Homo sapiens. It also meant that a small-brained species persisted far longer than once assumed possible. The unresolved question, however, lay not in the age but in the context. How had so many individuals come to rest in a chamber so remote? The narrow passages did not suggest easy access. Predators were unlikely to drag bodies so deep. Floodwaters could not explain the placement, as there was no channel leading directly to the chamber. Step by step, alternative explanations weakened, leaving the possibility that Homo Naledi themselves had carried their dead into the depths. At a planetary scale, the discovery forces reflection on the diversity of human existence. Around 300,000 years ago, Earth's climates were shifting. Glaciers waxed and waned in the northern hemisphere, while Africa saw cycles of wet and dry. These rhythms opened and closed corridors for migration, influencing the distribution of animals and hominins alike. In this setting, multiple human species coexisted, each navigating survival in parallel. The bones in Rising Star became evidence of that multiplicity, a reminder that Homo sapiens were not alone. The chamber's silence endures even now. The bones tell us much, yet they also withhold secrets. Did Homo Naledi bring their dead deliberately, acknowledging loss in a way once thought impossible for small-brained beings? Or were they trapped, victims of missteps in the darkness? The debate continues, unresolved, suspended in the same shadowed halls where the remains were first laid. For the explorers who first lowered themselves into the cave, the discovery was both physical and intellectual. Their bodies had to twist through stone, but their minds had to twist through assumptions as well. The Rising Star fossils demanded that science reconsider the links between brain size, behavior, and meaning. They asked what it means to belong to the genus Homo, and whether care for the dead is older, deeper, and more widespread than once believed. Step by step, the bones from Rising Star moved from darkness into light, from silence into discourse. They continue to rest in museum drawers and digital archives, examined and re-examined by scientists seeking clarity. And yet, the chamber where they were found still waits, carved deep into limestone, holding echoes that science has not yet fully heard. When the first reconstructions of Homo Naledi were presented, attention quickly turned to the most striking detail of all, their small brains. The skulls from Rising Star showed capacities ranging between 465 and 610 cubic centimeters. By comparison, modern humans average around 1,350 cubic centimeters, more than double. Even Homo erectus, a species over 1 million years older, possessed larger brains on average. The revelation startled researchers. A species living as recently as 300,000 years ago, overlapping with early Homo sapiens, carried a brain size comparable to Australopithecines that had walked the Earth nearly 2 million years earlier. Brain size had long been used as a rough measure of intelligence and complexity. Larger brains were associated with symbolic thought, language, and cultural practices. Smaller brains were linked to more basic behaviors. Yet Homo Naledi unsettled this neat hierarchy. If indeed they had carried their dead into deep caves, if they had used fire, and if they had made tools, then they challenged assumptions about the link between brain size and cognitive capacity. The skulls revealed more than volume. Their shape was distinct. The cranium was long and low, with sloping foreheads and pronounced brow ridges. The back of the skull projected slightly, forming an angular profile. These features looked primitive, echoing species far older. Yet the face itself was more delicate. The nose was narrow, the jaw relatively small. Teeth were modest in size, lacking the large chewing surfaces of earlier hominins. This blend of ancient and derived features made classification difficult. The puzzle deepened when scientists studied the rest of the skeleton. The hands were particularly intriguing. Their fingers curved strongly, a trait well suited for climbing trees. But the thumbs and wrists looked modern, capable of precise grips. Such hands suggested a species comfortable both in the branches and on the ground, perhaps using tools while still retaining a climbing lifestyle. The feet, in contrast, appeared almost fully human. With long arches and aligned toes, they were built for efficient walking over long distances. The legs, too, were slender and proportioned for upright movement. The shoulders and rib cage leaned toward the primitive. The clavicles angled upward, positioning the shoulders high and broad, reminiscent of Australopithecines. The rib cage flared outward at the bottom, giving the chest a bell-like shape. These details implied that Homo Naledi retained climbing abilities well beyond what most later Homo species displayed. In their bodies, they embodied both past and present, a mosaic of traits reflecting evolutionary pathways not yet fully understood. A lesser-known observation concerns their height and weight. The fossils suggest that Homo Naledi stood around 1.45 meters tall and weighed between 40 and 55 kilograms. This made them smaller than most Homo erectus and far smaller than Neanderthals. They were light, compact beings, perhaps agile in movement, capable of squeezing into caves with ease. Their small size may even have aided their access to chambers like the one in Rising Star. What appears unusual to us may have been natural for them. The unresolved mystery is why such a small-brained species survived so late. By 300,000 years ago, Africa was already home to early Homo sapiens, with larger brains and advanced tool-making traditions. How did Homo Naledi endure alongside them? Did they occupy marginal environments? Did they rely on ecological niches requiring climbing skills and mobility? Or did they perhaps avoid competition by withdrawing into landscapes others ignored, including the cave systems where their bones were found? These questions remain open, inviting speculation, but resisting firm answers. At a planetary scale, the survival of Homo Naledi during this time highlights the diversity of human existence. Across the globe, different lineages coexisted. Neanderthals thrived in Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans left traces in Siberia and interbred with ancestors of modern populations in Oceania. In Africa itself, Homo sapiens began to expand, developing technologies that foreshadowed later advances. Amid these lineages, Homo Naledi persisted, their small brains defying expectations about evolutionary progress. The Earth was not home to a single dominant species, but to a branching network of humans adapting in many ways, step by step. Scientists sought to understand what the size of the Homo Naledi brain implied. Did small volume mean simple thought? Not necessarily. Studies of endocasts, the impressions left by brains on the inside of skulls, hinted at organization similar in some ways to modern humans. Certain areas, especially those linked with social behavior and planning, appeared proportionally expanded. If accurate, this meant that structure, not sheer volume, might have shaped their abilities. A small brain could still be specialized, efficient, and capable of tasks thought beyond its size. The debate continues. Some argue that the rising star remains proof that complexity can arise independently of brain enlargement. Others caution that evidence for symbolic behavior among Homo Naledi is still tentative. Perhaps they did not ritualize death but merely disposed of bodies to avoid predators or disease. Perhaps their use of caves was practical, not symbolic. In this view, brain size still mattered, and Homo Naledi's apparent behavior does not imply deeper cognition. Yet the chamber's placement, its remoteness, and the repeated presence of multiple individuals make such utilitarian explanations less convincing. One subtle comparison brings scale into perspective. A brain of 465 cubic centimeters is similar to that of a chimpanzee. Yet chimpanzees, despite their intelligence, do not bury their dead in caves. They mourn, they show awareness of death, but they do not carry bodies into hidden chambers. If Homo Naledi truly did so, they crossed a threshold unknown in other apes. The threshold lies not in brain size alone, but in the choices made when faced with mortality. Outside the caves, life pressed on. Grasslands expanded and contracted with changing rainfall. Rivers carved paths through the earth, sustaining herds of antelope and zebra. Predators roamed, lions, hyenas, leopards. For small-bodied hominins, survival required vigilance, and they may have climbed trees at night for safety. They may have relied on cooperative foraging, moving together in small bands. In such an environment, the act of placing the dead in deep caves could also have served a practical purpose, removing bodies from the reach of scavengers. Yet even if practical, it implied foresight, planning, and coordination. The story of Homo Naledi's small brain is not simply about limits. It is about possibilities. The fossils remind us that brain size does not draw a simple line between the capable and the incapable. Instead, behavior emerges from context, structure, and need. In the cradle of humankind, a small-brained species found ways to endure, to adapt, and perhaps to reflect in ways once thought beyond them. And so, the mystery lingers. A species with a brain scarcely half our size descended into darkness, leaving behind skeletons that whisper of intention. Their brains were small, but their legacy is large, reshaping how science views the path of human evolution. They show that the story of humanity is not a straight ascent toward larger brains and greater intelligence, but a branching tree where even the smallest leaves hold profound significance. When the age of Homo Naledi was finally determined, it altered the framework of human history. Dating methods placed their existence between 236,000 and 335,000 years ago. This was not the deep past of 2 million years ago, when early Homo erectus roamed, nor the very recent past of 40,000 years, when Neanderthals walked their last steps in Europe. It was the middle ground, a window of time where multiple human lineages coexisted. The finding revealed that Homo Naledi was not an ancient relic preserved far too long in isolation. They were a contemporary species, sharing Africa with the earliest forms of Homo sapiens. This overlap was striking. For decades, scientists assumed that the appearance of modern humans in Africa coincided with the disappearance of more archaic hominins. Progress was thought to follow a linear path. Older species vanish, newer species take their place. But the fossils in Rising Star broke this expectation. A small-brained species had survived in South Africa at the very moment when our own ancestors were evolving the capacities that would lead to language, symbolism, and art. Step by step, the family tree of humankind became more entangled. Around the same period, Neanderthals were establishing themselves in Europe, adapting to cold climates with stocky bodies and complex social systems. In Asia, Denisovans left genetic traces that persist in people of Oceania and parts of East Asia today. Across the African continent, early Homo sapiens developed stone technologies more advanced than any before. In this chorus of species, Homo Naledi's voice was unexpected, small, quiet, yet persistent. A lesser-known detail concerns the precision of dating. Initially, some scientists suspected that the fossils might be millions of years old. Their primitive anatomy suggested deep antiquity, but once the bones were tested, it became clear they were surprisingly young. The methods used included uranium-thorium dating on cave flowstones and electron spin resonance on teeth. These techniques cross-checked one another, confirming that the species lived during the late Middle Pleistocene. The realization meant that ancient-looking features could persist far longer than once assumed. Evolution did not sweep uniformly across the globe. Instead, traits lingered, survived, and sometimes reappeared. The unresolved mystery is how Homo Naledi interacted with other hominins. Did they meet Homo sapiens, exchanging knowledge or even genes? Or did they remain isolated, tucked into ecological niches that shielded them from contact? No DNA has yet been recovered from the fossils, so the genetic relationship remains unclear. Their survival in the same time window suggests that contact was at least possible. Yet, without direct evidence, we cannot know whether they encountered our ancestors or simply lived parallel lives. At a planetary scale, the period around 300,000 years ago was one of transition. Climate oscillations drove the expansion and contraction of savannas and deserts across Africa. Rainfall shifted with monsoon patterns, tied to the advance and retreat of ice sheets far in the north. When glaciers grew, Africa often dried. When they melted, rivers and lakes expanded. These rhythms influenced every living creature, hominins, large mammals, and predators alike moved in response. In such a world, survival depended not only on biology but also on adaptability. Homo Naledi endured these cycles for tens of thousands of years, proof of their resilience. The recognition that Homo Naledi overlapped with early Homo sapiens forced scientists to reconsider definitions of modernity. If small-brained beings could live so recently and possibly perform complex behaviors, then modern humans were not the sole bearers of advanced traits, burial, care for the dead, and perhaps symbolic thought might not have been unique achievements of Homo sapiens. Instead, they may have emerged multiple times in multiple species across the branches of our lineage. This perspective finds echoes elsewhere. Neanderthals buried their dead in shallow graves, sometimes placing tools or flowers beside them. Denisovans, though poorly known, left ornaments and tools suggesting cultural sophistication. Early Homo sapiens carved symbols and strung beads. Now, with Homo Naledi, another species may be added to this tapestry. The shared behaviors hint at convergent developments, solutions to the universal challenges of life and death. Step by step, the picture of the human past grows more complex. The tidy ladder of evolution, rising neatly from primitive to advanced, has given way to a branching bush. Each branch twists in its own direction, some ending abruptly, others merging, still others persisting far longer than expected. Homo Naledi, with their mixture of ancient and modern traits, occupy a unique branch, not ancestral to us, yet not irrelevant. Their presence expands the possibilities of what it means to be human. A comparison of distances helps convey the scale. The temporal gap between Homo erectus in East Africa 2 million years ago and Homo Naledi in South Africa 300,000 years ago is vast, longer than the distance from Paris to Seoul if measured in years as steps. Yet despite this gulf, Homo Naledi preserved traits from those older ancestors. Evolution does not erase uniformly. It edits, retains, and recombines, leaving mosaics of form and behavior. Outside the caves, the land that Homo Naledi inhabited was full of life. Herds of antelope grazed the grasslands. Elephants trampled pathways to water. Predators prowled the edges, testing the vigilance of every herd. For small-bodied hominins, this was both opportunity and danger. Meat could be scavenged from predator kills. Plants and tubers could be gathered. Yet risk was constant. The caves may have offered refuge from such dangers, their depths providing shelter not only for the living, but also for the dead. The discovery of Homo Naledi's age reverberated far beyond South Africa. It underscored the importance of the African continent as the core of human diversity. Here, multiple species coexisted, adapted, and sometimes overlapped. The cradle of humankind was not simply the birthplace of a single lineage, but a meeting ground of many. The Rising Star Cave became a time capsule, revealing that the human story was never solitary. Still, unanswered questions remain. Did Homo Naledi vanish because of competition with Homo sapiens? Or did climate change gradually erode their habitats? Were they replaced, absorbed, or simply extinguished by chance? Without further fossils beyond Rising Star, their broader distribution is unknown. Perhaps more chambers, still sealed, still silent, hold answers. Until then, Homo Naledi remains both familiar and mysterious, a neighbor in time whose story is only partly revealed. The overlap with our own species gives their story particular weight. They remind us that humanity was once plural. To walk the earth 300,000 years ago was to share it with others who looked different, thought differently, and yet belonged to the same broad family. The Rising Star fossils give form to this forgotten plurality. They are proof that the path to us was never solitary but braided, woven of many strands. The chamber where Homo Naledi's bones were found is known as the Dinaledi Chamber. To reach it, explorers had to crawl, climb, and squeeze through a twisting vertical shaft known as the chute. The chute drops nearly 12 meters and narrows to only 20 centimeters in places. It is not a space where one could stumble by accident. The passage is demanding even for trained cavers equipped with modern lights and gear. For ancient hominins, carrying no ropes and working with firelight at best, the journey would have been daunting. Yet the presence of at least 15 individuals in this chamber makes clear that it was entered repeatedly. The geography of Rising Star Cave adds weight to the mystery. Unlike other fossil sites in the region, which often involve open pits or collapsed ceilings where animals fell in, the Naledi chamber has no such direct entry. Its only approach is the narrow chute. Bones could not have washed in by floodwaters, nor dragged in by predators. Every sign points to intentional placement. If so, this would represent one of the earliest known cases of deliberate deposition of the dead, step by step. The evidence builds. The bones were found in clusters, not scattered randomly. They showed no marks of gnawing or transport. Some skeletons were partially articulated, meaning they had not been disturbed after being laid down. The sediment around them contained no traces of catastrophic collapse or sudden burial by debris. The only conclusion many researchers find consistent with the facts is that Homo Naledi themselves carried their dead into the chamber and left them there. This interpretation startled the scientific community. For decades, deliberate burial had been considered a hallmark of large-brained humans and Neanderthals. It implied foresight, planning, and social concern. Yet here, in a chamber deep beneath South Africa, a small-brained species appeared to have done the same. The discovery pushed the boundaries of what behaviors could be associated with different hominins. A lesser-known detail involves the soot and blackened surfaces found in the cave. Some rocks within the chamber show possible traces of burning, suggesting that Homo Naledi may have carried torches into the darkness. Without light, the chamber would have been impenetrable. If fire was indeed used, it implies mastery of flame not only for warmth and cooking but also for navigation in confined spaces. The flickering of torches against limestone walls would have transformed the descent into an act both practical and symbolic. The unresolved question remains, why here? Why such a remote chamber rather than leaving the dead on the surface or in more accessible shelters? Some suggest it was to protect living spaces from disease or scavengers. Others think it might reflect a cognitive awareness of death, a desire to separate the dead from the living. Perhaps it was an early form of ritual, though the term itself must be applied with caution. The meaning of these actions is hidden from us, but the physical evidence endures. At a planetary scale, caves like Rising Star remind us of the power of geology in shaping human history. Over millions of years, rainwater dissolved limestone, carving voids and passages. These subterranean landscapes became shelters, traps, and places of deposition. For hominins, they offered both refuge and risk. In Africa, caves preserved fossils that otherwise would have vanished in open landscapes where wind and rain erase bones swiftly. The Naledi chamber is one such time capsule, sealed by stone and time until rediscovered in our century. The act of reaching this chamber by Homo Naledi invites comparison. Neanderthals in Europe dug shallow graves. Early Homo sapiens in Africa left ochre-stained burials with beads. Yet here, a species with a brain scarcely larger than a chimpanzee's may have chosen a path of extraordinary difficulty to place their dead. The act itself suggests cooperation. One individual could not have carried a body alone through the chute. Groups may have worked together, guiding, lifting, and passing remains into the depths. Such collaboration points to social bonds strong enough to endure the strain of the task. Outside, life would have continued as always. Herds grazed, predators prowled, rains came and went. Within the caves, however, a quieter drama unfolded. Again and again, bodies were brought through the chute. Whether placed carefully or simply left, the effect was the same. The chamber became a collective resting place. Over time, layer upon layer of bone accumulated, preserving a record of repeated actions. Some skeptics propose alternatives. Could the hominins have fallen accidentally, one by one, into the chamber? The chute, however, is too constricted, its slope too steep to make this likely. Could predators have dragged them in? No marks of teeth or claw support this. Could water have carried them? The chamber lacks a direct water channel. Each alternative weakens when weighed against the evidence. The simplest explanation remains intentional entry. A scale reference helps to appreciate the effort. The chute is taller than a 3-story building. To carry a body through such a space in near darkness with only fire as light would have taken determination. For Homo Naledi, smaller in stature than modern humans, the task was not impossible, but it demanded will. The fact that they did it repeatedly adds gravity to the interpretation. The Naledi chamber thus becomes more than a fossil site. It is a window into choices made hundreds of thousands of years ago. Choices that blur the line between practical action and symbolic behavior. Choices that suggest bonds within groups, where the dead were not abandoned but taken to a place apart. Even without ornaments or carved symbols, the act of repeated placement speaks volumes. At the planetary scale, this behavior broadens the map of human possibility. It shows that awareness of death, or at least the management of the dead, is not confined to large brains. It may emerge wherever social bonds and survival intersect. In this light, Homo Naledi joins Neanderthals and Homo sapiens as part of a shared story of how humans confront mortality. Yet the chamber keeps its silence. We do not know whether songs or gestures accompanied these acts. We do not know whether firelight cast meaning beyond illumination. All we know is that, deep in a South African cave, a species with small brains left behind one of the most compelling mysteries in paleoanthropology. When the bones from the Naledi chamber were carefully studied, patterns began to emerge. The arrangement of the remains was not chaotic. Instead, the skeletons appeared in clusters, with some lying nearly complete and others scattered but still associated with particular individuals. This order suggested that the bodies had not been jumbled by natural forces. Water would have carried bones away or mixed them beyond recognition. Predators would have left gnaw marks or scattered remains widely. Neither was the case here. The bones rested quietly, as if they had been placed and left undisturbed. Archaeologists noted that some skeletons were positioned in ways that implied limited movement after deposition. The delicate bones of hands and feet, often the first to scatter if disturbed, were preserved in near anatomical alignment. This detail was crucial. It indicated that bodies, not loose bones, had entered the chamber. Over time, as flesh decayed, the skeletons collapsed inward but remained largely intact. Such preservation speaks to careful placement rather than accident. Step by step, the chamber revealed signs of intention. The distribution of individuals suggested repeated use of the space. It was not a single catastrophic event that deposited them all at once. Instead, bodies were brought there on separate occasions. The chamber thus became a site revisited, remembered, and reused. This continuity implies a social pattern, one that endured across generations. For a small-brained species, this was unexpected. A lesser-known observation concerns the absence of other animals. In fossil-rich caves, it is common to find a mix of species: antelope, carnivores, rodents, birds. Yet in Naledi, hominin bones dominate almost exclusively. Only a handful of other remains appear, and none in comparable abundance. This absence strengthens the interpretation that the chamber was not a general trap or den, but a place specifically associated with Homo Naledi. The unresolved question, however, is whether these groupings truly represent ritualized behavior. Did Homo Naledi possess concepts of death, remembrance, or spirituality? Or was their action simply practical, moving the dead to a place away from living spaces, driven by hygiene or avoidance of predators? Without symbolic objects, such as tools, ornaments, or pigments, the line between ritual and practicality is blurred. Still, the repeated pattern of deposition suggests an element of cultural behavior, even if its meaning is lost to us. At a planetary scale, the act of returning to the same chamber over time resonates with broader patterns in human evolution. Across continents, hominins began to interact with caves not merely as shelters, but as spaces imbued with meaning. Neanderthals in Europe later used caves for burials and symbolic marks. Early Homo sapiens left paintings deep within caverns. Rising Star may represent an early echo of this trend, where subterranean spaces became more than geological formations. They became settings for acts of significance. The geology of the chamber reinforced its isolation. The chute leading down was narrow, steep, and twisting. To carry a body through it would have required coordination. Groups may have guided one another in the dark, using fire to light the way. The soot marks noted on cave walls suggest torches, their smoke lingering in confined air. Imagine the scene, a dim glow against rock, shadows flickering, bodies maneuvered slowly downward. It was labor-intensive, dangerous, and deliberate. Why endure such effort if not for a purpose? Skeletal analysis also offered insights into the individuals themselves. Adults, adolescents, and infants were represented. This wide age range suggested that the chamber was not reserved for a particular group, such as elders or males. Instead, it contained a cross-section of society. The inclusion of the very young is particularly striking. Carrying infants into the depths would have required as much effort as adults. Their presence suggests that the practice applied to all, not only to selected members of the group. Outside the chamber, the environment of the Middle Pleistocene shaped daily life. Grasslands expanded during wetter periods, offering rich grazing for animals. During drier spells, resources contracted, forcing hominins to travel farther for food and water. Within these cycles, Homo Naledi sustained themselves. Their small bodies and climbing skills may have given them advantages in certain niches, yet their choice to return to the chamber again and again shows that, beyond survival, they carried with them enduring social habits. Step by step, scientists compared these patterns to those seen in other species. Australopithecines, far older and smaller-brained, left no evidence of deliberate deposition. Homo erectus, with larger brains, left open-air sites with tools and fire, but no clear signs of burial. Neanderthals, later in time, did leave graves. Homo sapiens, eventually, created symbolic cemeteries. Where does Homo naledi fit within this sequence? They appear to represent an independent path, where small brains nevertheless engaged in complex behaviors. The chamber's stillness underscores the scale of the mystery. If Homo naledi indeed placed their dead deliberately, then they were engaging in behavior once thought impossible for a brain half the size of ours. This forces us to rethink the relationship between anatomy and culture. Intelligence may not grow in a straight line with brain volume. Instead, social needs, ecological pressures, and group cooperation may foster behaviors that appear advanced, even in species with limited cranial capacity. A scale comparison helps highlight the paradox. The average Homo naledi brain was smaller than that of Homo habilis, a species living nearly 2 million years earlier. Yet Homo habilis left no evidence of burial or symbolic action. Brain size alone does not determine outcomes. The rising star fossils demonstrate that behavior emerges from more than volume. It emerges from adaptation, necessity, and group identity. The absence of tools in the chamber is also intriguing. No stone flakes, no shaped bones, no ornaments accompany the bodies. This suggests that if Homo naledi used tools, they were not deposited with the dead. The act of deposition may have been minimal, bodies alone, placed and left. The simplicity does not diminish the significance, it may even highlight it. Stripped of objects, the action itself becomes the symbol, the movement of bodies into darkness, repeated across time. At the planetary scale, such practices reveal convergent evolution. Different species, different regions, seem to have approached death with care. Neanderthals did so in Europe. Homo sapiens did so in Africa and the Near East. Homo naledi did so in South Africa. These acts may not have shared the same meaning, but they reveal a common thread, awareness of death's impact on the living, and a need to respond through shared action. The chamber, therefore, stands as both a scientific site and a philosophical marker. It raises questions about what defines humanity. Is it language, art, burial? If Homo naledi, with their small brains and mixed anatomy, carried out deliberate deposition of the dead, then humanity is broader than once assumed. The line between symbolic and practical, between advanced and simple, becomes blurred. And so the bones remain, grouped and silent, their arrangement speaking where words cannot. They tell of hands that carried, of feet that climbed, of fire that flickered in narrow spaces. They tell of choices made in darkness, preserved in limestone until our time. The arrangement is careful, the meaning elusive, the mystery enduring. The discovery of Homo naledi in the Dinaledi chamber led researchers to confront a question once thought settled. Did this species truly bury their dead, or at least did they deliberately place them in a separate space, an act often described as a form of proto-burial? For much of the 20th century, burial was treated as a defining trait of modern humans, and perhaps of Neanderthals. It was linked to abstract thought, to the recognition of mortality, and to ritual. Yet the remains deep within Rising Star Cave suggested that such practices might not belong solely to large-brained species. The debate began immediately. Some scholars argued that the repeated placement of bodies across different ages and sexes in a chamber accessible only by deliberate effort constituted compelling evidence of intentional disposal. They pointed to the absence of other animal remains, the lack of predation mark, and the articulated skeletons as signs that these were not accidents. Instead, they argued, Homo Naledi chose to use this space for their dead, returning to it time after time. In this view, the chamber functioned much like a cemetery, though without the tools or ornaments found in later graves. Others urged caution. To them, the word burial carried implications that went too far. Burial implies digging, covering, or otherwise concealing bodies with deliberate ritual. The rising star evidence shows deposition, but not excavation. Some suggested the chamber might have acted as a natural trap, despite its difficulty. Perhaps individuals became lost or trapped while exploring the caves, and over generations, several met the same fate. Still, others proposed that Homo Naledi sought shelter in the chamber and never escaped, leaving their bodies to accumulate. These explanations, while possible, struggle to account for the sheer number of individuals, at least 15, and their consistent preservation. Step by step, the arguments grew. If Homo Naledi did carry their dead deliberately, what does that mean for our definitions of humanity? Can a brain 1/3 the size of ours conceive of death, of grief, or of ritual meaning? The very suggestion forces us to reevaluate the relationship between brain size and behavior. It also raises questions about the roots of symbolic thought. Perhaps such thought does not emerge suddenly with Homo sapiens. Perhaps it grows in parallel across multiple species, each experimenting with ways of responding to death. A lesser-known detail strengthens the argument for intentional action. Alongside bones, researchers found sediment layers that suggested repeated disturbance. In other words, the chamber was not filled all at once. Bodies were introduced over time, each new placement disturbing but not scattering older remains. This slow accumulation points to a tradition, a social habit, rather than a single event. It also hints at memory. Groups must have remembered the location and purpose of the chamber, returning to it when death occurred. Memory across generations is itself a marker of social complexity. The unresolved mystery, however, is meaning. Even if the bodies were placed deliberately, was the act symbolic, practical, or both? Removing the dead from living spaces could have reduced disease risk, protected survivors from predators, or cleared shelters. These are practical reasons, sufficient to motivate action. Yet the choice of such a remote and difficult chamber suggests something beyond mere convenience. The effort invested seems disproportionate if hygiene was the only goal. That disproportion opens the possibility of symbolic or emotional motives, though we may never know their form. At the planetary scale, burial or proto-burial becomes part of a broader pattern. Across continents, hominins experimented with ways of handling the dead. In Europe, Neanderthals dug shallow pits. In the Near East, Homo sapiens left ochre-stained burials. In Asia, Denisovans may have practiced rituals we can only infer from artifacts. The presence of deliberate deposition in South Africa adds another thread, showing that the awareness of death was not isolated, but widespread. Each species, in its own context, found ways of marking the boundary between life and death. The very act of placing a body in darkness carries weight. To descend with fire into the chamber, guiding or carrying a body, was to engage in shared labor. It required cooperation, timing, and strength. It was not the work of a single individual, but of a group. This collective effort suggests that the dead held significance for the living, enough to inspire communal action. In that sense, whether symbolic or practical, the act reflects the deep social bonds that shaped Homo Naledi's world. Outside the cave, daily life remained filled with survival. Hunting, gathering, foraging, and avoiding predators occupied much of their time. Yet the fact that they devoted energy to the dead indicates that survival was not their only concern. In their behavior, we glimpse the seeds of culture, the recognition that some actions carry meaning beyond immediate utility. Even without art or language as we know it, their choices echo through time as signs of awareness. Step by step, paleoanthropologists began to rethink categories. Was burial a single invention of Homo sapiens, or a convergent behavior that appeared multiple times? Could different species, facing similar challenges of mortality and memory, arrive at similar solutions? If so, then the roots of symbolic behavior run deeper and broader than once imagined. They are not the exclusive property of our lineage, but a shared inheritance across the human family. A scale comparison underscores this perspective. The earliest clear Homo sapiens burials date to around 100,000 years ago, more than 130,000 years after Homo Naledi's chamber. Neanderthal burials fall within a similar range, yet Homo Naledi, with far smaller brains, may have engaged in related behaviors long before. This suggests that cultural practices are not tied to brain size or to a single lineage, but to the complex social lives of hominins as a whole. Still, caution is necessary. Without artifacts, pigments, or carvings, the rising star evidence remains ambiguous. Archaeologists continue to debate, testing sediment, analyzing bone surfaces, and searching for traces of fire. Each discovery refines the picture, but the ultimate meaning may remain beyond reach. That, too, is part of the story. Prehistory often gives us evidence without explanation, leaving mysteries that invite reflection rather than closure. At the planetary scale, the question resonates beyond science. It reminds us that death has always been central to the human experience. How we respond to it, whether with burial, cremation, ritual, or silence, shapes communities. Homo Naledi, in their own way, seem to have faced the same challenge. Their chamber tells us that even small-brained beings sought to manage mortality, binding the living together through shared action for the dead. And so the debate continues: burial or deposition, symbolic or practical. What cannot be denied is that the chamber bears the marks of intention, repeated and enduring. It is a reminder that humanity is not a single straight line of progress, but a tapestry woven of many threads, each carrying its own form of care, memory, and meaning. Around the same time that Homo Naledi placed their dead within the dark passages of Rising Star, other hominins across Africa and Eurasia were leaving traces of their own emerging complexity. The world of 300,000 years ago was not inhabited by a single lineage but by several, each adapting to different environments, each experimenting with behaviors once thought unique to modern humans. To understand Homo Naledi fully, it is necessary to place them within this wider landscape of contemporaries, where Neanderthals, Denisovans, and early Homo sapiens lived side by side in the broader human story. In Europe, Neanderthals were spreading through forests, river valleys, the mountain ranges. They had large brains, averaging even slightly larger than those of Homo sapiens, and bodies adapted to cold climates. Their barrel-shaped chests and stocky limbs helped conserve heat, while their stone tools, the Mousterian tradition, demonstrated precision and planning. Archaeological sites show that Neanderthals sometimes cared for the injured, shared food, and buried their dead in shallow graves. These behaviors mark them as sophisticated beings, fully capable of complex social life. In Asia, Denisovans occupied a more shadowy position. Known primarily from DNA extracted from a single finger bone and a few teeth, they left little fossil record but an enormous genetic legacy. Their DNA appears in modern populations across Melanesia, Papua New Guinea, and parts of East Asia, showing that they interbred with the ancestors of present-day humans. Artifacts from Denisovan sites suggest advanced tool use, and their adaptation to high-altitude environments, such as the Tibetan Plateau, speaks to extraordinary resilience. Meanwhile, in Africa, early Homo sapiens were beginning to appear in fossils such as those from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, dated to around 315,000 years ago. These remains reveal faces recognizable as human, though with elongated skulls and primitive traits. Stone tools from these contexts mark a shift toward more refined technology, including blades and prepared cores. Alongside these tools, evidence of ochre use hints at symbolic practices, perhaps the earliest stirrings of art. Within this world, Homo Naledi's presence complicates the picture. Their small brains seemed out of place among such advanced contemporaries, yet their possible practice of deliberate deposition of the dead suggests they were not cognitively simple. Instead, they represent a parallel path, a species with primitive anatomy but behaviors overlapping with those of larger-brained cousins. This coexistence forces us to abandon linear models of progress. Evolution did not move in a straight ascent but in many directions at once. A lesser-known detail about this period is the sheer diversity within Africa itself. Fossil sites reveal not just Homo Naledi and Homo sapiens, but also other enigmatic remains, such as those from Florisbad in South Africa, dated to about 260,000 years ago, with a mixture of archaic and modern features. Genetic studies suggest that Africa hosted a network of populations exchanging genes, innovations, and ideas. In this mosaic, Homo Naledi's survival demonstrates that multiple hominin forms coexisted for long spans, each finding its ecological niche. The unresolved mystery is interaction. Did Homo Naledi ever meet Homo sapiens? Could small bands have crossed paths at waterholes or hunting grounds? If so, what would those encounters have been like? Peaceful avoidance, competition, or even occasional exchange? With no DNA yet extracted from Homo Naledi, we cannot know if interbreeding occurred. Their fossils remain isolated to rising star, with no tools or ornaments directly linked. The silence of evidence leaves the question open, a reminder of how much of prehistory is lost. At the planetary scale, the late Middle Pleistocene was a time of dynamic change. Glacial cycles reshaped continents, lowering sea levels and altering coastlines. In Africa, monsoon rains expanded and contracted, creating corridors of green across deserts, then withdrawing into drought. These fluctuations drove migrations, forcing populations to shift repeatedly. Such instability likely fostered innovation, as groups had to adapt quickly to changing resources. Across this shifting landscape, multiple hominin species survived side by side, sometimes overlapping in territory, sometimes separated by geography and climate. The coexistence of different lineages raises profound questions. If Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo sapiens, and Homo Naledi all lived within the same broad time frame, then the boundaries of humanity become porous. No single trait, large brains, and burial practices and tool use defines us alone. Instead, these capacities appear scattered across lineages, each contributing pieces of the puzzle. Burial by Homo Naledi. ornaments by early Homo sapiens, advanced tools by Neanderthals. Together, they reveal that the roots of humanity are shared, not singular. Step by step, paleoanthropologists have recognized this mosaic, the ladder of human progress, once imagined as a straight ascent, has been replaced by a tangled tree. Branches overlap, intertwine, and sometimes reconnect. Some end abruptly, others flourish, and some, like Homo Naledi, persist quietly in unexpected places. Their survival into the same era as Homo sapiens means that human history is richer and more varied than once assumed. The scale of distances helps capture this diversity. From South Africa, where Homo Naledi lived, to Europe, where Neanderthals thrived, spans more than 8,000 kilometers, to Asia, where Denisovans left their traces, is farther still. Yet across these distances, within the same window of time, multiple species developed overlapping behaviors: burial in one region, ornamentation in another, fire use in many. The convergences suggest that human-like capacities emerge not from a single point of origin, but from multiple experiments in cognition. The implications extend beyond science. The idea that Homo sapiens alone carried symbolic behavior once reinforced narratives of human exceptionalism. But the discovery of Homo Naledi weakens that exclusivity. If small-brained hominins could place their dead deliberately, then humanity is broader, older, and more diverse than we imagined. The roots of compassion, memory, and meaning may reach deeper into our family tree, branching into species we once dismissed as primitive. Outside the caves, these species lived their daily lives. Neanderthals hunted large game, Denisovans crafted tools, Homo sapiens experimented with pigments, and Homo Naledi returned again and again to the same chamber. Each acted in response to its environment, but together they formed a chorus of behaviors that foreshadowed our present. The late Middle Pleistocene was not a silent prelude, but a flourishing of diversity, a moment when the world was alive with many kinds of humans. The mystery endured, but the lesson is clear. Homo Naledi did not exist in isolation. They were part of a world filled with other hominins, each contributing in their own way to the shared story of humanity. Their presence reminds us that the past was crowded, complex, and interconnected. It was a world where different species of humans lived side by side, adapting, experimenting, and sometimes echoing one another's choices in the face of life and death. When the first bones of Homo Naledi were examined, researchers noticed something puzzling. Although no stone tools were found directly in the Naledi chamber, the anatomy of the hands and wrists hinted strongly at tool-making ability. Their thumbs were broad and powerful, their wrists shaped for precision grips. These were not the clumsy hands of an ape, but hands capable of striking flakes from stone or shaping wood into useful forms. The curved fingers suggested a continued adaptation for climbing, but the overall structure revealed potential far beyond tree dwelling. In the broader region around the Rising Star cave system, stone tools from the Middle Pleistocene are well documented. Simple flakes, cores, and scrapers litter sites of similar age. Some belong to what archaeologists call the Middle Stone Age, characterized by prepared core techniques that produce sharp, standardized flakes. Although none of these artifacts can be definitively linked to Homo Naledi, their presence raises important questions. Were these tools made by early Homo sapiens who shared the landscape, or might some have been crafted by Homo Naledi themselves? Step by step, the evidence is weighed. The morphology of the Homo Naledi hand is strikingly modern in its capacity for forceful grips and controlled precision. The wrist bones align in ways similar to those of modern humans and Neanderthals, both accomplished tool users. The fingers, though curved, would not have prevented tool use. Instead, they suggest a dual lifestyle, one foot in the trees and another on the ground. It is plausible, therefore, that Homo Naledi had both the ability and the need to make tools. A lesser-known clue lies in fragments of animal bone found in the Rising Star cave system, outside the Dinaledi chamber. Some show marks that could be consistent with cutting or processing. While interpretation is difficult, such traces hint at tool use in the vicinity. If Homo Naledi indeed processed carcasses, then tools must have been part of their daily life, even if not carried into the burial chamber. The chamber itself may have been a space reserved for the dead, stripped of the everyday tools of living. The unresolved mystery is direct association. Without tools found alongside Homo Naledi bones, certainty is impossible. Archaeologists remain cautious, aware of how easily artifacts from different layers can mingle in cave environments. Still, the convergence of anatomy, surrounding evidence, and comparative studies keeps the possibility alive. If Homo Naledi did make and use tools, it would expand the picture of their cognitive world, aligning them with behaviors long associated only with larger-brained species. At a planetary scale, tool use during the Middle Pleistocene was undergoing transformation. Across Africa, prepared core technologies were spreading. These methods required foresight, planning, and the ability to visualize a finished tool before striking the stone. In Europe, Neanderthals refined the Mousterian tradition, crafting scrapers, points, and blades. In Asia, Denisovans likely employed advanced flake tools, though few sites preserved their artifacts. Against this backdrop, the presence of Homo Naledi raises the possibility that multiple species with different brain sizes and anatomies participated in this technological flowering. Fire, too, enters the discussion. In Rising Star, traces of soot on limestone surfaces suggest that torches once burned within the passages. Without artificial light, the chambers would be impenetrably dark. If Homo Naledi carried bodies into these spaces, they must have used fire to guide their way. Fire, however, is more than light. It is warmth on cold nights, protection against predators, and a means of cooking food. Mastery of fire marks a critical step in human evolution, one that reshaped diets, daily rhythms, and social gatherings. Step by step, researchers examined the cave walls, noting blackened patches and possible hearth residues. Though interpretation remains debated, the possibility of fire use by Homo Naledi cannot be dismissed. If they wielded torches, it implies knowledge of how to create and control flame. Such knowledge would demand teaching, learning, and shared practice, elements of culture transmitted across generations. Outside the caves, stone tools and fire would have been essential for survival. The landscapes of South Africa, alternating between open grassland and wooded thickets, required versatility. Stone scrapers could prepare hides for clothing. Flakes could cut tubers or butcher game. Fire could extend activity into the night or make otherwise inedible foods digestible. In such a world, the ability to use tools and fire would be more than convenience. It would be life itself. A scale comparison brings perspective. Homo erectus, living nearly 2 million years earlier, left abundant evidence of stone tools and fire. Neanderthals, with larger brains, mastered both. if Homo Naledi, with their small brains, joined this tradition, then technology was not the monopoly of brain size but a shared capacity of humanity. The convergence across species suggests that once basic thresholds of anatomy and sociality were met, the leap to tool and fire use was likely. Still, the chamber remains silent about these aspects of life. No stone flakes, no hearths, no charred bones accompany the skeletons. The absence may be meaningful. Perhaps Homo Naledi deliberately left tools behind, separating the realm of the living from that of the dead, or perhaps tools simply never entered the chamber, being too valuable to abandon. The mystery endures, reminding us that what survives in archaeology is always fragmentary, always partial. At the planetary scale, this fragmentary nature echoes everywhere. The record of early humans is incomplete, shaped by chance preservation and discovery. In one place, bones survive, but tools are absent. In another, tools lie abundant, but bones are gone. In yet another, fire traces remain while the people who made them vanish without a trace. Together, these fragments form a mosaic, imperfect but powerful, showing that humanity's story is not linear but scattered across continents and millennia. The possibility of tool and fire use by Homo Naledi deepens their enigma. It shows that small brains do not preclude complex behavior. It suggests that cognition may arise in different ways, shaped by need, cooperation, and tradition. It blurs the lines between primitive and advanced, revealing instead a spectrum of capacities distributed across species. And so, the tools of Homo Naledi remain hypothetical, their fire uncertain, their daily life only partially glimpsed, yet their anatomy whispers of potential, their environment demanded adaptation, and their caves hint at light and shadow. Whether or not the proof is ever found, the idea of Homo Naledi shaping stone and carrying flame lingers as one of the most provocative questions in paleoanthropology. The silence of the Dinaledi chamber raises another question. How did Homo Naledi move within such profound darkness? The passages of Rising Star twist and narrow until no natural light can enter. For explorers today, even with headlamps and protective gear, the descent is demanding. Without artificial light, the chamber would be pitch black, an environment utterly hostile to sight. Yet soot traces on the cave walls suggest that ancient hands once carried fire into those depths. If confirmed, this would mean that Homo Naledi, despite their small brains, not only mastered fire but used it deliberately to penetrate the underground. The evidence for fire inside Rising Star is subtle but important. On certain walls, blackened patches appear, faint but distinct. These patches differ from natural mineral stains, showing instead the irregular deposition typical of smoke. In some areas, fragments of burnt bone and charred sediment have been reported, though their interpretation remains contested. To many researchers, the most plausible explanation is the use of torches or small fires lit and carried by hominins who needed illumination to navigate. Without fire, the deposition of bodies deep in the chamber would have been impossible. Step by step, the reconstruction emerges. Imagine the preparation: gathering branches or resinous wood, setting flame to them, and carrying the glowing bundle into the narrow entrance. The smoke would cling to the rock, leaving residues that endure even after hundreds of thousands of years. The flickering flames would light only a small circle, leaving shadows to dance on the walls. Groups moving together into the chute would have had to coordinate, passing fire from one to another, ensuring it did not extinguish. The task was not simple, but it was repeatable, as the chamber holds many individuals deposited over time. A lesser-known observation comes from comparative sites. Elsewhere in South Africa, caves of similar age contain evidence of fire use, including ash layers and hearths. At Wonderwerk Cave, located more than 200 kilometers away, controlled fire is documented as early as 1 million years ago, associated with Homo erectus. This shows that the knowledge of fire had long existed in southern Africa. If Homo Naledi inherited or maintained this tradition, then their use of fire in Rising Star fits into a broader regional pattern of hominin adaptation. The unresolved mystery lies in control. Did Homo Naledi know how to ignite fire independently, or did they rely on capturing flames from natural sources such as lightning strikes? The difference is significant. To control fire without knowing how to produce it would limit its use, binding it to rare opportunities. To create fire at will, however, requires technical skill and knowledge passed down through generations. Archaeologists debate this point, for the evidence is too fragmentary to decide. Yet either way, their ability to bring light into complete darkness speaks of planning and cooperation. At the planetary scale, fire represents one of the great turning points in human evolution. It altered diets by making tubers digestible and meat safer. It extended the day, allowing social interaction after sunset. It kept predators at bay, reshaping relationships with dangerous animals. For species across the human lineage, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, fire became central. If Homo Naledi also used it, then they joined this shared human tradition, participating in one of the most transformative steps of prehistory. The soot marks also reveal something about persistence. Fire leaves only fragile traces, often erased by water, sediment, or collapse. The fact that traces remain after hundreds of thousands of years shows that the flames were significant, repeated often enough to leave marks that endured. These marks are silent testimony to acts once performed in urgency and care. They remind us that archaeology often relies on the most delicate clues, remnants of ordinary actions preserved against all odds. Step by step, we can envision how Homo Naledi organized their tasks. A group might gather at the cave entrance, prepare torches, and then descend together. One or two would lead, holding the flames, while others followed, guiding or carrying the body of a deceased companion. The chute demanded cooperation. Torches had to be passed downward without extinguishing. Smoke would fill the narrow shaft, forcing them to move quickly but carefully. Once in the chamber, they would place the body on the ground, retreat, and leave the chamber again in darkness. Such acts, repeated over time, suggest more than chance. They imply a tradition. Outside the caves, the mastery of fire would also have shaped daily life. Nights around a fire would bring safety and warmth. Fire would allow cooking of fibrous plants, unlocking nutrients otherwise inaccessible. Small-bodied hominins like Homo Naledi would have benefited greatly from these advantages, offsetting the challenges of their size. Socially, fire may have become a gathering point, reinforcing bonds and enabling the sharing of food and stories, though the latter remains beyond direct evidence. A scale comparison helps illustrate the challenge. The Dinaledi chamber lies nearly 30 meters from the surface, through twisting passages and a chute taller than a 3-story building. Carrying a flame this distance without letting it die would have been a feat of persistence. Modern cavers describe the space as claustrophobic, hot, and airless. For Homo Naledi, the challenge was greater still. Yet they did it not once, but repeatedly, enough to leave soot behind. This scale of effort strengthens the case for intention. The discovery of soot also broadens our understanding of Homo Naledi's cognitive abilities. To carry fire underground requires anticipation, preparing torches in advance, knowing they will be needed, and ensuring that they last long enough to serve their purpose. It requires a concept of space, of darkness to come, and of tools to counter it. Such foresight goes beyond instinct. It belongs to beings who plan and remember, who pass knowledge from one occasion to the next. Still, caution remains. Some scientists argue that soot may have come from natural fires that burned in the landscape and drifted into caves over time. Others suggest that later human visitors might have left the marks. Without absolute dating of the soot itself, uncertainty lingers, yet the placement of blackened surfaces deep within the chamber, beyond casual access, continues to support the hypothesis of Homo Naledi's presence with fire in hand. At the planetary scale, fire also connects Homo Naledi to a lineage of innovation stretching across continents. While Neanderthals in Europe used fire to shape tools and cook food, and early Homo sapiens in Africa experimented with pigments and hearths, Homo Naledi may have used fire in a uniquely symbolic way to illuminate the path of the dead. If so, their flames joined a universal human theme, the merging of light, darkness, life, and death. The traces of soot remind us that light once flickered where none exists today. They tell of a species small in brain but large in determination, venturing into places of danger and silence. They show that technology, even in its simplest form, can transform the impossible into the possible. Whether practical or symbolic, the use of fire in Rising Star illuminates not only caves, but also the deeper possibilities of what it means to be human. The discovery of Homo Naledi raised one of the most intriguing puzzles in paleoanthropology. How could a species with such a small brain have engaged in behaviors that seemed so advanced? For more than a century, scientists linked brain size with intelligence, assuming that larger brains equated to more complex thought and symbolic action. Yet the Rising Star cave, with its chamber of the dead, forced a reconsideration. If the bones had been deliberately placed and if fire had been carried into the depths, then Homo Naledi demonstrated a cognitive world that did not match their cranial volume. The average brain size of Homo Naledi ranged from 465 to 610 cubic centimeters, close to that of chimpanzees and far smaller than the 1/200 with 400 cubic centimeters of modern humans. Even Homo erectus, more than 1,000,000 years older, often had a larger brain. Traditional models of human evolution emphasized an upward trend, with brain expansion marking the path towards symbolic thought, language, and culture. Yet the fossils from Rising Star disrupt this narrative. Here was a species living as recently as 300,000 years ago, contemporary with Homo sapiens, yet with a brain less than half the size. Step by step, the evidence of behavior accumulates. The chamber of the dead suggests intentional deposition. The soot marks hint at controlled fire. The anatomy of the hands points toward tool-making ability. Each piece of evidence contradicts the expectation that a small brain meant only simple behaviors. Instead, Homo Naledi may have possessed cognitive capacities that allowed planning, cooperation, and memory, capacities that we once thought belonged only to larger-brained relatives. A lesser-known detail comes from endocast studies. When scientists examined the inner surfaces of Homo Naledi skulls, they found impressions suggesting brain organization different from that of apes. Certain regions, particularly those linked to social behavior and planning, appeared relatively expanded compared to overall size. This does not mean Homo Naledi had the same abilities as modern humans, but it suggests that brain structure, not only volume, influenced behavior. A smaller but efficiently organized brain could still support complex actions. The unresolved mystery is how far this complexity extended. Did Homo Naledi understand death in symbolic terms? Did they engage in ritual, or was their deposition of the dead purely practical? Did they communicate with gestures or sounds beyond those of apes? We do not know. Without art, ornaments, or direct evidence of language, answers remain elusive. Yet the very existence of the chamber forces the question. It implies foresight, coordination, and repeated cultural practice, behaviors difficult to reconcile with the idea of a cognitively simple species. At a planetary scale, the Homo Naledi puzzle reframes human uniqueness. For decades, modern humans and Neanderthals were seen as the pinnacle of symbolic life. They buried their dead, created ornaments, and used pigments. Yet if Homo Naledi also engaged in burial-like practices, then symbolic thought was not restricted to big-brained species. It may have emerged multiple times, different lineages, as a response to shared challenges of social life and mortality. Humanity, in this sense, is not defined by brain size but by behaviors arising in diverse contexts. The implications ripple outward. Brain size alone cannot serve as a strict measure of intelligence. Elephants and whales possess brains larger than ours, yet their cognitive capacities are expressed differently. Among hominins, Neanderthals had brains as large or larger than modern humans, yet their symbolic expressions took different forms. Homo Naledi, with a much smaller brain, may have still reached thresholds of planning and cooperation that blur the line between primitive and advanced. Step by step, paleoanthropologists revised their models. Instead of a ladder of progress, with bigger brains leading to greater intelligence, the evidence suggested a branching tree. Different lineages experimented with different cognitive strategies. Some evolved large brains, others smaller but efficient ones. Some developed symbolic behavior tied to art, others to burial, others perhaps to tool-making or fire. The diversity shows that cognition is not a single track, but a mosaic of adaptations. Outside the caves, the daily life of Homo Naledi would have tested their abilities constantly, foraging for food, avoiding predators, and raising young required planning and cooperation. Fire, if mastered, demanded knowledge of how to keep it alive. Tool use, if practiced, required learning and teaching. In these tasks, cognitive flexibility mattered as much as sheer brain volume. Even without language as we know it, Homo Naledi may have relied on gestures, vocalizations, and shared memory to coordinate. A scale comparison makes the paradox vivid. Imagine two species meeting at a waterhole 300,000 years ago. One, Homo sapiens, with a brain of 1/300 cubic centimeters, capable of shaping blades and experimenting with pigments. The other, Homo Naledi, with a brain scarcely larger than a chimpanzee's, yet perhaps also able to make tools, light fires, and place their dead in caves. Both species, so different in anatomy, nevertheless navigated the same landscapes, faced the same predators, and used strategies that required foresight. The gap in brain size did not produce a simple gap in behavior. The cognitive puzzle also raises questions about the evolution of symbolic life. If Homo naledi engaged in behaviors once thought restricted to large-brained humans, then perhaps symbolic capacity is older and more widespread than assumed. Perhaps it does not begin with Homo sapiens at all, but with a deeper, shared heritage across multiple species. This idea challenges long-standing narratives of human exceptionalism, broadening our view of what it means to be human. Still, caution remains. Some argue that the evidence for deliberate burial is not conclusive. Without clear signs of ritual, the deposition of bodies could be explained as practical disposal. The soot marks might belong to later humans, not to Homo naledi. The endocasts provide only indirect clues and direct measures of thought. The debate is ongoing, reflecting the limits of the fossil record. Yet even within these limits, Homo naledi forces us to consider that complexity cannot be measured in cubic centimeters alone. At the planetary scale, this realization resonates with broader lessons. Evolution does not produce single lines of progress. It produces variety, experiment, and diversity. Homo naledi's small brain but complex behavior is one such experiment, reminding us that intelligence takes many forms. For scientists and listeners alike, it invites humility. The past was more crowded, more varied, and more surprising than simple hierarchies suggest. The chamber of rising star remains one of the most evocative sights in human history. In its darkness, Homo naledi left not only bones, but questions. Questions about what kind of beings they were, how they thought, and how they remembered their dead. Questions about how cognition arises, not from size alone, but from structure, social need, and shared practice. These questions remain unanswered, echoing through stone corridors, waiting for new evidence to bring clarity. And so the cognitive puzzle of Homo naledi endures. They show us that small does not mean simple, and that even in the deep past, humanity was not defined by a single path. In their bones, soot, and chamber of silence, they remind us that intelligence is not measured only in size, but in the choices made against the vast backdrop of time. When the findings from Rising Star were first announced, the scientific community reacted with both excitement and caution. On one hand, the discovery of Homo naledi added an entirely new branch to the human family tree. On the other, the interpretation of their behavior, especially the possibility of deliberate burial, sparked intense debate. At conferences and in journals, paleoanthropologists exchanged arguments, weighing the evidence from the chamber against long-held assumptions about cognition and symbolism. Section 12 belongs to this arena of debate, where competing perspectives still unfold. Those who support the interpretation of intentional deposition highlight several key points. First, the chamber's inaccessibility. To reach it requires deliberate effort, even for small and agile individuals. Second, the number of skeletons, at least 15 from infants to adults, argues against accident. Third, the preservation of bones without marks of predation or water transport suggests that the bodies were placed intact. Taken together, these elements form a consistent pattern. A species repeatedly carried their dead into the chamber using fire for light and left them in darkness. In this view, Homo naledi practiced a behavior that parallels burial, even if they did not dig graves. Skeptics, however, warn against quick conclusions. They argue that unusual geological processes might have created the pattern we see. Perhaps the chamber once had a wider opening, now collapsed, through which individuals fell. Perhaps flooding events deposited the bodies in ways not yet fully understood. Some note that without tools, ornaments, or pigments in the chamber, evidence for ritual is absent. They caution that interpreting intention from bones alone risks overreaching, especially with a species whose brain was so small. For these scholars, simpler explanations, such as accident or natural trap, remain on the table. Step by step, the debate sharpened. Supporters of intentional burial pointed to parallels with Neanderthals, who sometimes buried their dead without artifacts. If Neanderthals, with larger brains, could do so, why dismiss similar evidence in Homo Naledi? Critics countered that Neanderthal sites include clearer patterns, pits dug, bodies placed carefully, sometimes with grave goods. Rising Star, they argued, lacks such clear markers. The bones may lie together, but without direct signs of ritual, caution is warranted. A lesser-known aspect of the debate is methodological. Caves are complex environments. Sediment layers shift, ceilings collapse, and water leaves deposits over long spans. Interpreting context requires careful stratigraphy and dating. In Rising Star, some layers remain poorly understood. Skeptics emphasize this uncertainty, suggesting that alternative geological explanations must be excluded before behavioral ones are accepted. Proponents, meanwhile, argue that the repeated placement of so many individuals makes geology an unlikely sole explanation. The unresolved mystery is not only about the bones, but also about interpretation itself. How do we recognize intention in the archaeological record? What criteria mark the difference between practical disposal and symbolic burial? Is carrying a body into a dark chamber already evidence of symbolic thought? Or could it be a practical solution to keeping living areas clean? Without words, art, or clear ritual objects, these questions remain open. The Rising Star fossils sit precisely at this boundary, forcing scholars to confront the limits of evidence. At a planetary scale, such debates reveal how human history is constructed not only from fossils, but also from frameworks of interpretation. Each discovery reshapes assumptions, challenging what it means to be human in Europe. Neanderthals once were seen as brutish, incapable of culture, until evidence of burial and art changed perceptions. In Asia, Denisovans were unknown until a finger bone transformed understanding of human diversity. Now, Homo Naledi demands similar reconsideration. Their small brains clash with behaviors once tied exclusively to large-brained species, disrupting neat categories. The debates also highlight the role of open science. The Rising Star team shared 3D scans of bones widely, inviting global participation. This transparency accelerated analysis but also spread controversy, as more scholars examined the fossils and offered competing interpretations. The openness reflects a new era in paleoanthropology, where discoveries no longer belong to a single group but to a global community. With many eyes come many perspectives, fueling debates that remain unresolved. Step by step, new lines of evidence continue to emerge. Ongoing excavations in nearby chambers have revealed additional bones, suggesting that Homo Naledi used more than one underground space. Some sediments show traces of burning, possibly indicating controlled fire. If confirmed, this strengthens the case that they entered deliberately, bringing light with them. Yet skeptics caution that fire traces might belong to later visitors, including early Homo sapiens. The debate grows more intricate with each new find. Outside the academic world, the story of Homo Naledi has captured public imagination. News headlines spoke of a new species of human, of mysteries in the dark. For many, the image of small-brained beings carrying their dead into a cave was both haunting and inspiring. Yet the scientific debate reminds us that interpretation is complex. Archaeology rarely offers certainty, it offers probability, patterns, and puzzles. Rising Star is one such puzzle, its meaning not fixed, but continually negotiated. A scale reference emphasizes the stakes. If Homo Naledi truly practiced deliberate deposition, then burial, or proto-burial, occurred at least 100,000 years earlier than previously thought, and in a species with brains no larger than chimpanzees. This would rewrite timelines of cognitive evolution, forcing us to accept that behaviors once considered uniquely human are far older and more widespread. If, on the other hand, the chamber represents accident or natural process, then Homo Naledi remains fascinating but less revolutionary. The interpretation changes the weight of the discovery, shaping its place in human history. The debates echo broader questions in anthropology. What defines humanity? Is it language, art, burial, or symbolic thought? If Homo Naledi shared some of these traits, then humanity is not confined to Homo sapiens, but stretches across multiple lineages. If not, then Homo sapiens may still stand apart. Either way, the Rising Star discovery ensures that the boundaries of humanity are reconsidered. At the planetary scale, this reconsideration matters because it reminds us that evolution is not a ladder, but a branching tree. Different species explored different paths. Some developed large brains and complex tools. Others, like Homo Naledi, retained small brains but may still have reached surprising levels of cooperation and planning. Each branch adds to the richness of the whole, expanding what we mean by human history. And so the debates continue in conference halls, in journal pages, and in the quiet of field sites. Scientists weigh bones against hypothesis, soot marks against geology, possibility against caution. Rising Star remains a site of both evidence and interpretation, where certainty is elusive but insight is profound. The controversy itself is a sign of progress, showing that science thrives on questioning and on the humility to admit what we do not yet know. Outside the caves where Homo Naledi left their dead, the wider landscape of southern Africa unfolded in shifting patterns of savanna, woodland, and river valley. To understand the life of this small-brained species, one must picture not only the dark chambers of Rising Star, but also the open spaces where they foraged, travelled, and survived. The land of the Middle Pleistocene was a place of constant change, driven by rhythms of climate and season, shaping the options available to every living creature. The terrain around Johannesburg, now dotted with cities and roads, would then have been open grassland broken by clusters of thorn trees, patches of forest, and rocky ridges. Herds of antelope grazed in the clearings, their movements followed by lions and hyenas. Elephants and rhinoceroses roamed the plains, creating trails that other animals, including hominins, could follow. Rivers and seasonal streams carved lifelines through this environment, concentrating both prey and predator. And for Homo Naledi, such landscapes offered both abundance and danger. Step by step, their survival required careful use of available resources. Plant foods, tubers, fruits, seeds would have been staples gathered by hand or dug from the ground. Small animals, reptiles, and birds might have supplemented diets, perhaps captured with simple tools or scavenged from predator kills. Water sources dictated movement, drawing groups to reliable springs in dry seasons. Shelter could be found among rocky overhangs, in tree canopies, or within the mouths of caves. Daily life was a cycle of searching, moving, and resting, guided by the rhythms of the environment. A lesser-known detail emerges from pollen records and faunal remains in the Cradle of Humankind. These suggest that the environment shifted dramatically over relatively short spans. Wet phases created lush grasslands, supporting large herds of grazing animals. Dry phases reduced vegetation to sparse scrub, challenging all who lived there. For Homo Naledi, such fluctuations meant constant adaptation. Their smaller bodies, compared to other hominins, may have helped conserve energy, while their climbing ability offered refuge in times of danger. The unresolved mystery is how Homo Naledi competed or avoided competition with other hominins on the landscape. If early Homo sapiens occupied parts of Africa at the same time, their larger brains and more advanced tools may have given them an advantage in exploiting resources. Did Homo Naledi inhabit marginal environments, places less attractive to others, or did they occupy overlapping ranges, meeting occasionally at waterholes or migration routes? The lack of evidence for direct contact leaves these questions open, but the possibility of shared landscapes remains. At a planetary scale, the Middle Pleistocene was a time when climate pulses reshaped entire continents. As ice expanded and retreated in the northern hemisphere, rainfall belts shifted across Africa. Lakes swelled and then dried, deserts opened and then closed. These cycles created corridors of green across the Sahara and savanna patches across southern Africa. Hominins moved in response, tracking herds, following rivers, and learning to endure scarcity. Homo naledi's persistence across tens of thousands of years shows that even with small brains, they mastered this dance of change. Predators were a constant presence. Lions and leopards prowled the grasslands, while packs of hyenas hunted in groups. Crocodiles lay in wait at rivers, and snakes hid in tall grasses. For small-bodied hominins, vigilance was essential. The ability to climb trees offered a measure of safety, though not immunity. Nights might have been spent in elevated refuges, away from ground predators. Yet these dangers also created opportunities. Predator kills left carcasses that could be scavenged, providing meat and marrow-rich bones. Such scavenging may have played a role in Homo naledi's subsistence, as it did for earlier hominins. Step by step, archaeologists reconstruct these lifeways through indirect evidence. Stone tools found in nearby regions suggest that hominins of this period used sharp flakes to cut plants or butcher animals, while no tools have been found directly with Homo naledi. Their anatomy supports such use. Fire, if controlled, would have provided additional security. Imagine small groups gathered around flames at night, the light pushing back darkness, the smoke keeping insects away. Such scenes, though speculative, fit with what is known from other hominins of similar periods. The scale of distances traveled also matters. To gather enough resources, groups may have roamed widely across tens of kilometers, returning seasonally to favored areas. Their feet, nearly identical to modern humans, were well adapted for long-distance walking. Paths likely followed river courses or animal trails, linking water sources and foraging grounds. Migration patterns of antelope and zebra may have influenced their own, as the availability of prey and plant foods rose and fell with the seasons. A lesser-known clue comes from the animal bones of the region. Certain antelope species thrive only in open grassland, while others prefer woodland cover. Their presence in fossil assemblages shows that environments oscillated between openness and enclosure. Homo naledi's mixed anatomy, climbing shoulders, walking feet, may reflect adaptation to this shifting mosaic. In open phases, walking carried them across plains. In closed phases, climbing offered safety and foraging options. This dual capacity may have allowed them to persist when more specialized species struggled. The unresolved mystery is social life. How large were their groups? Did they live in extended families or in loose bands? Evidence is scarce, but the repeated use of the Naledi chamber suggests group-level decision-making. Carrying bodies into caves required cooperation, memory, and social bonds. If they could collaborate in death, they likely collaborated in life. Sharing food, protecting young, and coordinating movement would have been essential. The social fabric of Homo naledi remains invisible to archaeology, yet hints of it shine through in their actions. At the planetary scale, such cooperation echoes patterns seen in other hominins. Neanderthals cared for the injured. Homo sapiens built symbolic communities, and even earlier species may have shared tasks. Homo naledi fits into this continuum, showing that cooperation was not confined to large brains. It was a survival strategy that spread widely, binding groups together against the challenges of their environments. Step by step, life on the savanna imposed its rhythm. Dawn brought foraging, midday brought rest in shade, evening brought the search for water and safety. Nights may have been tense, filled with the sounds of predators. Over weeks and seasons, groups shifted territories, following rains or avoiding drought. Across years and generations, the memory of landscapes built traditions, where to find roots in dry times, where to locate fruit in wet ones, where caves offered refuge in storms. This accumulation of knowledge passed through groups became a cultural map of survival. The bones from Rising Star remind us that Homo naledi were not only beings of caves, but also beings of landscapes. Their story includes both the darkness of chambers and the light of open plains. They lived in a world alive with animals, changing with climate, demanding constant attention. Their small brains did not prevent them from navigating this complexity. Instead, their bodies, skills, and cooperation carried them through, allowing them to endure in one of the most dynamic periods of Earth's history. And so the life of Homo naledi on the ancient landscape remains a story told in fragments. Fossils whisper of walking feet and climbing shoulders. Pollen tells of shifting grass and trees. Animal bones reveal predators and prey. Together, these fragments sketch a portrait of beings who adapted, endured, and left behind a mystery deeper than stone. The world in which Homo naledi lived was shaped not only by the local savannas and woodlands of southern Africa, but also by planetary-scale forces. During the Middle Pleistocene, Earth's climate was governed by vast glacial cycles, the waxing and waning of ice sheets across the northern hemisphere. These cycles, stretching over tens of thousands of years, determined rainfall, vegetation, and the very shape of coastlines. To understand Homo naledi is to situate them within these rhythms, where distant ice and global winds dictated local survival. Every 100,000 years or so, great glaciers advanced and retreated across North America and Eurasia. When ice expanded, sea levels dropped by more than 100 meters, exposing continental shelves and altering ocean currents. When ice melted, seas rose, flooding coasts and shifting climates once more. These changes were not confined to distant regions, they rippled across the globe. In Africa, rainfall belts moved north and south with each glacial pulse, bringing wet phases that filled lakes and rivers, followed by dry phases that spread deserts. Homo Naledi, though living far from the ice, felt its influence in every season of their lives. Step by step, the environment of southern Africa transformed. In wetter periods, savannas flourished, rivers swelled, grasses thickened, and herds of antelope multiplied. Food was abundant, and predators were spread thin across wide territories. In drier periods, however, waterholes shrank, vegetation withered, and competition intensified. Groups of hominins had to travel farther to find sustenance, sometimes crossing dangerous ground where predators concentrated. These swings, occurring across centuries and millennia, shaped the adaptive strategies of all who lived there. A lesser-known detail emerges from sediment cores and fossilized lake beds in Africa. These records show that rainfall could change drastically in only a few centuries for hominin groups. This meant that the environment of grandparents could be very different from that of grandchildren. Memory and tradition were tested by change. Knowledge of landscapes had to be flexible, adjusting to new water sources and shifting herds. Homo Naledi, with their dual adaptations for climbing and walking, may have been well suited to such variability, able to exploit both open savannas and wooded refuges. The unresolved mystery is how Homo Naledi responded to the broad migrations these cycles encouraged. Other hominins, such as Homo sapiens, expanded across Africa and eventually into Eurasia during favorable wet phases. Neanderthals moved with herds across glacial Europe. Did Homo Naledi also migrate, or were they confined to the southern regions where their fossils are found? The absence of their remains outside South Africa may suggest limited range, but caves elsewhere remain unexplored. Until more evidence appears, we cannot know whether they were local specialists or participants in wider dispersals. At the planetary scale, these cycles also influenced the rise and fall of species. Shifts in rainfall and temperature created windows of opportunity for some and closed them for others. The expansion of Homo sapiens across Africa may have been tied to such windows, when corridors of green opened across deserts. For Homo Naledi, survival during these shifts speaks to resilience. Even without advanced tools or large brains, they endured through multiple cycles, adjusting to landscapes that others might have found challenging. The caves themselves, where their bones were found, may have played a role in this adaptation. In times of drought, caves offered cooler microclimates and protection from predators. In times of abundance, they may have served as safe shelters near water and food sources. Over millennia, groups might have returned repeatedly to the same caves, embedding them into cultural memory. The choice to place the dead within such spaces may reflect this deep familiarity, turning natural shelters into social landmarks. Step by step, one can imagine the interplay between global cycles and local lives. A glacial advance far to the north lowers sea levels, shifting ocean currents. Monsoons weaken, southern Africa grows dry. Homo Naledi bands move toward rivers, forage widely, and perhaps climb more often for safety. Centuries later, the ice recedes, rains return, rivers swell, and herds flourish. Groups expand their ranges, food is abundant, and children grow in times of plenty. These long rhythms form the background of their existence, unseen but deeply felt. A scale comparison emphasizes the immensity of these forces. The distance from the glaciers of Europe to the savannas of South Africa is thousands of kilometers, yet the two were linked by atmospheric circulation and ocean currents. Changes in one hemisphere echoed in the other. For Homo Naledi, this meant that survival depended not only on local skills but also on forces beyond their knowledge. They lived in landscapes shaped by ice they would never see, by seas they would never reach, yet by processes that determined the rains above their heads. A lesser-known connection ties Homo Naledi's time to the story of Homo sapiens. Around 300,000 years ago, early humans in Morocco, Ethiopia, and Kenya were also adapting to these cycles. Genetic evidence suggests that populations within Africa were diverse and interconnected, sometimes isolated by dry phases, sometimes mixing during wet ones. Homo Naledi may have been part of this larger mosaic, another thread woven into the fabric of African diversity. Whether they exchanged genes, ideas, or simply shared landscapes with others, their existence adds depth to this picture. The unresolved mystery remains their fate. Did shifting climates eventually reduce their habitats, forcing them into smaller ranges until they vanished? Did competition with Homo sapiens push them aside? Or did they simply dwindle gradually, their numbers never large enough to withstand the pressures of change? The record is silent. Only the chamber of bones tells us they lived, adapted, and endured for a time, before disappearing from view. At the planetary scale, such disappearances are common. Species rise and fall as climates shift. Entire ecosystems bloom in wet phases and vanish in dry ones. The cradle of humankind is littered with fossils of lineages that thrived for a while and then faded. Homo Naledi, despite their mystery, may be one more of these stories, resilient in their time, yet not destined to last. Their survival for tens of thousands of years, however, is testimony to their success, however temporary. Step by step, the planetary cycles remind us that human evolution was never a story of steady progress. It was a story of adaptation to change, of persistence through instability. Homo Naledi embodies this truth. With small brains and mixed anatomy, they nevertheless lived through periods of drought and abundance, of scarcity and opportunity. Their chamber of the dead is a monument not only to their choices, but also to their resilience against forces larger than themselves. And so, the link between glaciers far away and caves in South Africa becomes clear. The great cycles of Earth shaped the savanna, rivers, and woodlands that Homo Naledi called home. In those shifting landscapes, they foraged, climbed, walked, and remembered their dead. Their story is one of survival in the face of planetary rhythms, of persistence at the edge of change, of humanity expressed in forms we are only beginning to understand. Deep within the limestone of Rising Star, the Dinaledi chamber holds its silence. For thousands of years, the bones of Homo Naledi have rested there, untouched by light, sealed by stone and time. When modern explorers first reached the chamber, the discovery revealed not only new fossils but also new questions that remain unresolved even now. In many ways, this final section is less about answers than about the enduring echoes left in darkness, where intention and mystery intertwine. The skeletons of Homo Naledi tell us who they were in body: small, lightly built, with curved fingers, climbing shoulders, and walking feet. Their skulls reveal small brains, yet their context suggests behaviors beyond expectation. The arrangement of bones, the soot on the walls, the repeated presence of multiple individuals together. These details imply deliberate action. Whether that action was ritual, practical, or something in between, it points toward a cognitive world richer than brain size alone would predict. Step by step, the chamber demands interpretation. Was it chosen as a final resting place for the dead? Was it a practical solution to remove bodies from the living group, protecting against predators or disease? Or was it a symbolic act, an early form of ritual that acknowledged death with meaning? Archaeologists cannot yet decide. Each explanation has strengths. Each has weaknesses. The truth may lie in a space between categories we impose, a space shaped by the daily lives and needs of a species whose thoughts remain unknown. A lesser-known aspect of the chamber is its emotional impact on modern researchers. Those who descended the chute describe the silence, the closeness of rock, the sensation of stepping into a space preserved outside of time. To uncover the bones of infants and elders, side by side, is to confront a pattern of life and death that speaks directly across hundreds of thousands of years. Even scientists trained in detachment feel the weight of such encounters, a reminder that the past is never entirely separate from the present. The unresolved mystery continues to circle around cognition. Did Homo Naledi experience grief? Did they recognize individuality in death? Did they gather as groups to carry out these acts, binding themselves through shared memory? Without artifacts, art, or written words, these questions may never be answered. Yet the evidence of repeated placement, of torchlight carried into darkness, of bodies left in stillness, suggests that their lives held patterns of meaning. Whether symbolic or pragmatic, those patterns are part of what makes them human in their own way. At a planetary scale, the chamber becomes more than a local curiosity. It reminds us that humanity has always been plural. The Middle Pleistocene world held Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, early Homo sapiens across Africa, and Homo Naledi in the south. Each species adapted, endured, and in some cases, cared for their dead. Burial and symbolic action are not the sole invention of Homo sapiens, but part of a broader tapestry. The echoes of Rising Star join the echoes of Neanderthal graves and sapien cemeteries, all threads in a shared fabric of humanity. The soot on the walls remains one of the most evocative traces. It is a sign of light, carried deliberately into dark, of fire, harnessed not only for cooking or warmth, but also for navigation in the depths. That soot bridges the practical and the symbolic. It is evidence of planning, of foresight, and of determination to complete a task. It is also evidence of persistence, for torches must have been prepared, carried, and lit again and again. Each mark of soot is a silent record of firelight that once flickered, of shadows that once danced, of choices made by hands now long gone. Step by step, the story of Homo Naledi reshapes assumptions. It shows that small brains do not equal small minds, and that evolutionary history is not a straight ladder but a tangled tree. It shows that behaviors once considered unique may, in fact, be shared, convergent, or reinvented. It shows that humanity is not confined to a single lineage, but spread across many, each contributing pieces of the puzzle. A scale comparison highlights the depth of this insight. If we measure brain size alone, Homo Naledi ranks with species long considered primitive, yet in behavior they may overlap with Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. This mismatch breaks the old equation of volume with complexity. Instead, it reminds us that intelligence can take many forms, emerging from social need, ecological pressure, or cultural habit. The chamber of rising star embodies this truth in every bone it holds. The chamber also underscores the fragility of evidence. We see only fragments, bones without flesh, soot without flame, chambers without words. What is missing is vast. No ornaments, no pigments, no engravings survive to clarify meaning. The absence could mean they never existed, or it could mean they were lost to time. Archaeology always works with silence as much as with sound, with absence as much as with presence. Rising Star is no different, a site of profound finds, surrounded by profound gaps. Yet even in silence, the chamber speaks. It speaks of persistence, of groups who carried bodies through darkness. It speaks of resilience, of a species who endured climate shifts and predation with limited tools. It speaks of connection, of social bonds strong enough to inspire repeated journeys into danger. These echoes carry beyond science, into reflection on what it means to be human. They remind us that mortality, memory, and meaning have long been part of our lineage in forms both familiar and strange. At the planetary scale, the legacy of Homo Naledi is humility. They remind us that we are not the only humans to have walked the earth, not the only ones to have faced death with intention. They remind us that intelligence is diverse, that humanity is broad, that the story of our origins is richer than a single thread. They remind us that caves, bones, and firelight can hold lessons as enduring as any text. And so the Dinaledi chamber remains quiet beneath the hills, holding its secrets. Perhaps future excavations will uncover tools, pigments, or DNA that clarifies the mystery. Perhaps other caves will reveal more of their range. Or perhaps what we have now is all we will ever know, a chamber of bones, soot on walls, and questions that will not fade. Either way, the story endures, deepening our understanding of what it means to be human, and widening the boundaries of humanity itself. The story of Homo Naledi closes not with certainty but with silence. In the chambers of Rising Star, bones still lie where they were placed, dusted by centuries of sediment, untouched by sun or wind. They remind us that prehistory is not a tale of answers but of questions, layered deep in stone. Each fossil is a whisper, each soot mark a trace, each absence a silence louder than sound. Far away, glaciers wax and wane, seas rise and fall, climates shift and return. Against these vast planetary rhythms, the lives of small-bodied hominins flicker briefly, yet their presence endures, written into limestone, carried into our time. Homo Naledi challenges us to think differently about intelligence, about symbolism, about what it means to be human. Perhaps they did not grieve as we do. Perhaps their actions were practical, not symbolic. Or perhaps they recognized, in their own way, the passage from life into death, and sought to mark it with care. We cannot know, but in their persistence, in their choices, in their very mystery, they remain part of our story. And so the chamber rests dark and still. The bones of Homo Naledi lie where they have lain for thousands of years, holding secrets beyond reach. Their echoes remain with us, gentle reminders that humanity was never singular, never simple, never fixed. The past is crowded, and in that crowd we find not only ourselves, but also others who shared the earth, walked the savannas, and carried their dead into the quiet of the earth.